The howl of the blizzard masked the sound of Catherine Everett's desperate prayers, but not from the ears of the man who would change her fate forever. Cole Evans had been riding through the Colorado mountains for 3 days straight, seeking shelter from a storm that seemed determined to bury the entire frontier under a blanket of white death. His horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Duke, struggled through drifts that reached past the animal's knees. The year was 1876, and the winter had proven to be one of the harshest anyone could remember. Cole's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he squinted against the wind, searching for any sign of shelter. The temperature had dropped so low that his beard had frozen, and ice crystals clung to his thick wool coat. That was when he saw her. At first, Cole thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, that perhaps the cold had addled his brain. But no, there was definitely a figure kneeling in the snow about 50 yards ahead, barely visible through the swirling white curtain of the storm. He urged Duke forward, his heart pounding with concern and confusion. What kind of fool would be out in this weather, and why would they be kneeling in the snow? As he drew closer, Cole could make out the details. It was a woman, her dark hair whipping around her face, her hands clasped together in prayer. She wore nothing but a thin dress and a shawl that provided almost no protection against the brutal elements. Her lips were moving, and though Cole could not hear her words over the wind, he could see the desperation in her posture. "Madam!" Cole shouted, dismounting as quickly as his frozen limbs would allow. "Madam, you need to get out of this weather." The woman's eyes snapped open, and Cole found himself staring into the most striking green eyes he had ever seen. They were filled with tears that had frozen on her cheeks, creating crystalline tracks down her pale skin. For a moment, she simply stared at him as if he were an apparition, her lips parted in shock. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, I was praying for help. I was praying for someone to save my sister." "Where is your sister?" Cole asked urgently, already removing his thick coat and wrapping it around the woman's trembling shoulders. "We need to get you both to shelter immediately, or you will both freeze to death out here." "The cabin," the woman said, pointing with a shaking hand toward a stand of pine trees about 100 yards away. "She is sick, so sick. I came out to pray because I did not know what else to do. We have no medicine, no food left, and the fever will not break. I begged God to send someone who could help us." Cole did not waste another second. He lifted the woman onto Duke's back, then grabbed the reins and began leading the horse through the snow toward where she had pointed. The woman swayed in the saddle, clearly exhausted and half frozen. Cole kept one hand on her leg to steady her as they pushed forward through the storm. "What is your name?" Cole asked, trying to keep her alert and conscious. "Jane," she replied through chattering teeth. "Jane Vaughn. My sister is Julia. We have been here for 2 weeks, waiting for our cousin to come for us, but he never arrived. Then Julia got sick, and I could not leave her to seek help." "How did you end up out here alone?" Cole asked, concern flooding through him. This was no place for 2 women without proper supplies or protection. "Our parents died of cholera 3 months ago in Kansas," Jane explained, her voice breaking. "We were supposed to meet our cousin in Marysville, Colorado, but there was a stagecoach accident. The driver was killed, and we were stranded. We found this abandoned trapper's cabin and took shelter, but then the storms came and Julia fell ill. The cabin finally came into view, a rough structure made of logs that looked as though it might collapse at any moment. But it was shelter, and that was all that mattered." Cole tied Duke to a post near the entrance and helped Jane down from the saddle. She nearly collapsed, but Cole caught her, supporting her weight as they stumbled to the door. Inside, the cabin was barely warmer than the outside, with a dead fire in the small stone hearth and frost coating the inside of the walls. On a narrow cot in the corner lay another young woman, her face flushed with fever, her breathing labored and shallow. Even from across the room, Cole could see how sick she was. "Help me get this fire going," Cole said, gently guiding Jane to a chair before he began gathering what little firewood remained stacked against the wall. His fingers were numb and clumsy, but he managed to get kindling arranged and struck a match from the waterproof tin he always carried. Within minutes, flames were licking at the wood, and blessed warmth began to spread through the small space. Cole turned his attention to the sick woman on the cot. He placed a hand on her forehead and immediately pulled back at the intense heat radiating from her skin. This was no ordinary fever. He had seen enough illness on the trail to know that this woman was in serious danger. When did the fever start? Cole asked Jane, who had moved to kneel beside her sister's cot, clutching Julia's hand. 5 days ago, Jane replied, tears streaming down her face. At first it was just a cough and a headache, but then the fever came and it has only gotten worse. She barely wakes now. I have tried everything I know, but nothing helps. Cole stroked his beard, thinking quickly. He had some basic medical supplies in his saddlebags, including willow bark for fever and some herbs that might help. But what this woman really needed was a doctor, and the nearest town with a proper physician was at least 2 days' ride away in good weather. In this blizzard, it might as well have been on the moon. I have supplies that might help, Cole said, standing and heading back outside to retrieve his saddlebags from Duke. The cold hit him like a physical blow after the relative warmth of the cabin, but he pushed through it, unhooking the leather bags and grabbing his bedroll as well. Duke whinnied in protest at being left outside. I know, boy, Cole said, patting the horse's neck. But there is not room for you in there, and you have weathered worse storms than this. I will bring you some feed and water. Back inside, Cole unpacked his supplies on the small wooden table that served as the cabin's only furniture besides the cot and 2 rickety chairs. He had willow bark, dried sage, some salt pork, coffee, beans, flour, and a small bottle of whiskey. It was not much, but it was more than the women had. First things first, Cole said, taking charge of the situation. We need to get some fluids into your sister and try to break this fever. Do you have any clean cloths? Jane produced a few relatively clean pieces of fabric from a small trunk in the corner, and Cole set to work. He boiled snow in a pot over the fire until it turned to clean water, then steeped willow bark and sage in it to make a medicinal tea. While that brewed, he showed Jane how to sponge Julia's face and arms with cool water to help bring down the fever. Who are you? Jane asked as they worked side by side. Why were you out in this storm? My name is Cole Evans, he replied, carefully lifting Julia's head and trying to get her to sip some of the medicinal tea. I am a rancher from Montana Territory. I was on my way back from Denver after selling some cattle when the storm caught me. I was looking for shelter when I saw you praying in the snow. Jane's eyes filled with fresh tears. I was praying for a miracle, she said softly. I was praying for God to send someone who could help us. I did not think anyone would actually come. Well, I am here now, Cole said, meeting her gaze. There was something about this woman that stirred something deep in his chest, something he had not felt in years. She was beautiful, certainly, even half frozen and exhausted, but it was more than that. It was the courage it must have taken to kneel in that killing cold and pray instead of simply giving up. It was the love she clearly had for her sister, the determination in her eyes even as hope seemed lost. Through the night, Cole and Jane worked together to care for Julia. They took turns sponging her down, getting small amounts of tea and water into her, and keeping the fire going. Cole went out several times to tend to Duke and bring in more firewood from the small covered pile he found behind the cabin. Each time he returned, he found Jane still awake, still tending to her sister with unwavering devotion. "You need to rest," Cole finally said as dawn began to break outside, the storm showing signs of easing. "You will be no good to her if you collapse from exhaustion." "I cannot rest while she is like this," Jane protested, but her eyes were heavy with fatigue. "Then rest while I watch over her," Cole insisted. "I promise I will wake you if there is any change." Reluctantly, Jane agreed. She wrapped herself in Cole's heavy coat and curled up in one of the chairs near the fire. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing deep and even. Cole watched her for a moment, struck by how young she looked in sleep, how vulnerable. He guessed she could not be more than 22 or 23 years old, close to his own age of 26. Cole turned his attention back to Julia, continuing to administer the medicinal tea at regular intervals and keeping her comfortable. As the morning progressed, he noticed that her fever seemed to be dropping slightly. Her breathing was still labored, but it seemed less strained than it had been during the night. Hope flickered in Cole's chest. Jane woke around midday, sitting up with a start and immediately looking toward her sister's cot. "How is she?" she asked urgently. "The fever has dropped a few degrees," Cole reported, and he was rewarded with a brilliant smile from Jane that made his heart skip a beat. "She is not out of danger yet, but I think she has turned a corner." Jane rushed to her sister's side, pressing her hand to Julia's forehead. "You are right," she breathed. "Oh, thank God, thank you, Cole, thank you so much." "Do not thank me yet," Cole cautioned, though he could not help but smile at her obvious relief. She still has a long road ahead of her. Over the next several days, Cole and Jane fell into a comfortable routine of caring for Julia. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a pristine white wilderness. Cole ventured out to hunt, managing to bag a couple of rabbits that provided much-needed protein for their small group. He also made several trips to the nearest stream to fill their water containers and care for Duke. As Julia slowly improved, Cole found himself spending more and more time talking with Jane. He learned that she was 22 years old, just as he had guessed, and that she had been helping her parents run a small general store in Kansas before they died. She had always dreamed of teaching school, she told him shyly, and had been hoping to find such a position in Marysville once she and Julia were settled. "What about you?" Jane asked him one evening as they sat by the fire while Julia slept peacefully. "What brought you to ranching in Montana Territory?" Cole leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant with memory. "I grew up in Texas," he said. "My father was a rancher, and I always knew I wanted to follow in his footsteps. But he lost the ranch to creditors when I was 18, and he died shortly after, I think from heartbreak as much as anything else. I worked as a ranch hand for several years, saving every penny I could. 3 years ago, I finally had enough to buy my own place in Montana. It is not much, just a small spread with 100 head of cattle, but it is mine." "It sounds wonderful," Jane said softly. "You must be proud." "I am," Cole admitted, "but it is lonely work. I have a couple of ranch hands who help out during the busy seasons, but most of the time it is just me and Duke out there. There are not many women in that part of Montana, and the ones who are there are already spoken for." Jane looked down at her hands, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I imagine it must be hard," she said, "being alone like that." "It is," Cole agreed, his eyes fixed on her face. "At least it was. This past week has reminded me what I have been missing." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement of the growing connection that had formed as they worked together to save Julia's life. Cole reached out and gently took Jane's hand in his. Her fingers were slim and delicate in his calloused palm, but they gripped his hand firmly. "Jane," Cole said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know this is not the most romantic setting, and I know we have only known each other for a week, but I have to tell you how I feel. From the moment I saw you praying in that snow, something in my heart recognized something in yours. You are the bravest, most devoted, most beautiful woman I have ever met." Jane's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Cole, I feel the same way. When I was out there in the snow, freezing and desperate, I prayed for help. But I think God sent me more than just help. I think He sent me you." Cole stood and gently pulled Jane to her feet, drawing her into his arms. She came willingly, pressing her cheek against his chest as he wrapped his arms around her. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, feeling the rightness of being together. "When Julia is well enough to travel," Cole said quietly, "I want to take you both to Marysvale. Your cousin might still be there waiting for you, or we can send word to find out what happened to him. But Jane, I also want you to know that if you are willing, I would like to court you properly. I want to see where this connection between us leads." Jane pulled back just enough to look up at him, her green eyes shining. "I would like that very much," she whispered. Cole could not help himself. He lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers in a gentle, tender kiss. Jane responded immediately, her arms coming up to circle his neck as she kissed him back. It was a kiss filled with promise and hope, with the beginning of something precious and real. From the cot, Julia's weak voice interrupted them. "It is about time," she said, a smile in her voice despite her obvious weakness. "I have been awake for the past 10 minutes wondering if he was ever going to kiss you." Jane laughed and hurried to her sister's side. "Julia, you are awake. How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a herd of buffalo," Julia admitted. "But I am alive, thanks to both of you. And Jane, I saw him carry you in here that first night when I was drifting in and out of consciousness. I saw how he looked at you. He is a good man." Cole felt his ears burn with embarrassment, but he could not stop smiling. "I am glad you are feeling better, Julia. You gave us quite a scare." "I gave myself quite a scare," Julia replied. "But I am going to be fine now, I can feel it. And Jane, you should definitely let this man court you. Anyone who would ride through a blizzard and then spend days nursing a stranger back to health is worth keeping." Over the next week, Julia continued to improve under Cole's care. Her fever broke completely, her appetite returned, and she was soon able to sit up and even walk a few steps around the cabin. Cole knew that once she was strong enough, they would need to make the journey to Marysvale, but he found himself in no hurry to leave the cozy cabin, and the time it afforded him to get to know Jane better. They talked for hours each day, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes and dreams, their fears and regrets. Cole told Jane about his plans for his ranch, how he wanted to expand the herd and maybe one day build a proper house instead of the small cabin he currently lived in. Jane shared her love of books and learning, her dream of opening a school, her desire to make a difference in the lives of children. "You could open a school near my ranch," Cole suggested one afternoon as they walked through the snow-covered forest, giving Julia some peace and quiet to rest. "There are several families scattered throughout that area, and they would love to have a proper teacher for their children." "Do you really think so?" Jane asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. "I know so," Cole assured her. "Mrs. Henderson, who runs the general store in the nearest town, has been trying to find someone to teach for years. Most young women who come out that way are either already married or get married so quickly that they do not have time to establish a school." Jane laughed. I can imagine that is true. The ratio of men to women must be quite skewed in Montana territory. It is, Cole agreed, which is why I can hardly believe my luck in finding you. They stopped walking and Jane turned to face him, her expression serious. Cole, I need you to understand something. I am falling in love with you, I cannot deny that. But Julia is my responsibility. I cannot just abandon her to pursue my own happiness. Whatever happens between us, she comes with me. I would not have it any other way, Cole said firmly. Jane, when I look at how you care for your sister, it only makes me love you more. Family is important to me too. Your sister will always be welcome in my home, in our home if you will have me. Are you saying what I think you are saying? Jane asked, her voice trembling slightly. Cole took both of her hands in his. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Jane Vaughn, when we get to Marysvale, I am going to buy you the prettiest ring I can find, and I am going to ask you properly to marry me. I am telling you now so you have time to think about it, to make sure it is what you want. But I need you to know that my intentions are completely serious. Tears streamed down Jane's cheeks, but she was smiling. I do not need time to think about it, she said. I already know my answer will be yes. Cole swept her into his arms and kissed her deeply, pouring all of his feelings into the embrace. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and flushed, Jane laughed with pure joy. I cannot believe this is happening, she said. 2 weeks ago, Julia and I were alone and desperate, and I thought we were both going to die in that cabin. Now Julia is recovering, and I am standing here with the man I love, planning our future together. Prayer is a powerful thing, Cole said softly. You prayed for help, and I was sent to answer that prayer. But I think maybe I was the one who needed help just as much as you did. I just did not know it until I found you. A few days later, Julia was strong enough to travel, and Cole announced that it was time to make the journey to Marysvale. The weather had cleared, and the sun was shining brightly on the snow-covered landscape. Cole fashioned a travois from branches and blankets, attaching it to Duke so that Julia could ride comfortably without having to sit upright in a saddle. Jane rode behind Cole on Duke's back, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his broad back. The journey took 2 full days, with Cole being careful not to push too hard and exhaust Julia. They camped one night in a sheltered valley, and Cole showed the women how to properly set up a wilderness camp. He told stories around the fire, making both sisters laugh with tales of his mishaps and adventures as a young cowhand. When they finally arrived in Marysvale, Colorado, a small mining town nestled in a mountain valley, it was late afternoon on a cold but clear day. The town consisted of one main street lined with wooden buildings, including a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a church, and a small building that served as both the post office and the marshal's office. Cole's first priority was getting the women settled at the boarding house, where a kind older woman named Mrs. Murphy fussed over Julia and insisted on bringing her hot soup and fresh bread. Once Julia was comfortable and resting, Cole and Jane went to the marshal's office to inquire about Jane's cousin. The marshal, a weathered man in his 50s named Tom Bradley, listened to their story with interest. John Vaughn, he said when Jane mentioned her cousin's name. Yes, I remember him. He came through here about 3 weeks ago, asking if anyone had seen 2 young women. When I told him no, he seemed very worried. He left word that if you turned up, I should tell you he had to return to Denver on urgent business but would be back within the month. Jane sagged with relief. At least he is alive and did not forget about us, she said. We were in that stagecoach accident and got stranded. We never made it to town, so he would not have known where to find us. "Well, you are here now and safe, thanks to this gentleman," Marshal Bradley said, nodding approvingly at Cole. "You did a good thing, young man, bringing these ladies in from the cold." Over the next several days, Cole and Jane explored the town together, while Julia continued to recover at the boarding house. Cole kept his promise and bought Jane a ring, a simple silver band with a small but pretty emerald that matched her eyes. He proposed formally one evening as they stood outside the small church, and Jane accepted with tears of joy streaming down her face. They decided to get married in Marysvale before heading back to Montana Territory. The local preacher, a jovial man named Reverend Peters, was delighted to perform the ceremony. Julia, now almost fully recovered, insisted on helping Jane prepare, and Mrs. Murphy offered to host a small reception at the boarding house. The wedding took place on a bright Saturday morning in early March. Jane wore a simple but lovely dress that Mrs. Murphy had helped her make from fabric purchased at the general store. Cole wore his best clothes, his hair neatly trimmed and his beard groomed. Julia stood up as Jane's witness, and Marshal Bradley agreed to stand up for Cole. As Cole and Jane exchanged vows in the small wooden church, with sunlight streaming through the windows and Julia weeping happily in the front pew, Cole could hardly believe that just a month earlier, he had been a lonely cowboy riding through a blizzard with nothing but his horse for company. Now he had a wife, a sister-in-law who felt like family, and a future that seemed brighter than anything he had ever imagined. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Peters declared with a broad smile. "Cole, you may kiss your bride." Cole did not need to be told twice. He gathered Jane into his arms and kissed her soundly, earning cheers and applause from the small gathering of townspeople who had come to witness the ceremony. When they finally pulled apart, both were grinning from ear to ear. The reception at the boarding house was a simple but joyful affair. Mrs. Murphy had made a small cake, and several of the townspeople brought dishes to share. There was music and dancing, and Cole held Jane close as they swayed to a fiddle tune, both of them lost in their own private world of happiness. "I love you, Mrs. Evans," Cole whispered in Jane's ear. "I love you too, Mr. Evans," Jane replied, her eyes shining. "More than I ever thought possible." Julia approached them as the party was winding down, her eyes bright with happiness. "I am so thrilled for you both," she said, hugging them each in turn. "Cole, thank you for not only saving my life but also for making my sister so happy." "Thank you for sharing her with me," Cole replied warmly. "And Julia, I meant what I said before. You are family now and you are always welcome in our home." "About that," Julia said, a slight blush coloring her cheeks, "I have been thinking, and I believe I would like to stay here in Marysvale for a while. Marshal Bradley mentioned that the town needs a seamstress, and I am quite skilled with a needle. I think I could make a good life here, and it would give you and Jane some privacy as newlyweds." Jane looked torn between happiness at her sister's independence and concern at being separated from her. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I do not want you to feel like you have to leave." "I am sure," Julia assured her. "Jane, you have taken care of me our whole lives, first helping mother and father with me, then taking care of me after they died, and now nursing me back to health after that fever nearly killed me. It is time for you to focus on your own life and your own happiness. I will be fine here, I promise, and it is not as though Montana Territory is on the other side of the world. We can visit." Jane hugged her sister tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You will always be my little sister," she said, "but you are right. You are a grown woman now, capable of making your own way in the world. I am so proud of you." 2 days later, Cole and Jane prepared to depart for Montana Territory. They had purchased a wagon and a second horse, loading it with supplies and furniture for their journey and their new life together. Julia came to see them off, along with Mrs. Murphy, Marshall Bradley, and several other townspeople who had befriended them during their short stay. "You take care of her," Julia said sternly to Cole, though her eyes were twinkling. "I will guard her with my life," Cole promised solemnly. "And you write to me often," Julia instructed Jane. "I want to hear everything about your new home and your adventures in Montana Territory." "I will write every week," Jane promised, hugging her sister one last time. "And you take care of yourself. Do not work too hard and make sure you eat properly." "Yes, Mother," Julia teased, making everyone laugh. The journey to Montana Territory took nearly 3 weeks, but Cole and Jane did not mind. They were together, and every mile brought them closer to their new home and their new life. They traveled slowly, enjoying the changing landscape as they moved north through Colorado and into Wyoming Territory, then finally into the vast, wild expanse of Montana Territory. Cole told Jane stories about the land they were traveling through, pointing out landmarks and sharing his knowledge of the frontier. Jane listened with rapt attention, eager to learn everything she could about her new home. At night, they camped under the stars, and Cole taught Jane how to read the constellations and navigate by the North Star. "You are a good teacher," Jane observed one night as they lay side by side in their bedrolls, watching the heavens wheel overhead. "And you are a good student," Cole replied, reaching over to take her hand. "But you are going to be an even better teacher once you start your school." "Do you really think the families in the area will want to send their children to me?" Jane asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I know they will," Cole assured her. "You are educated, kind, patient, and passionate about learning. What more could anyone want in a teacher?" When they finally arrived at Cole's ranch in late March, Jane could not contain her excitement. The property was beautiful, nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance and a clear stream running through it. The cabin was small, as Cole had warned her, but it was sturdy and well built, with a stone fireplace and real glass windows. "It is perfect," Jane breathed, turning in a slow circle to take in the view. "Cole, this is absolutely perfect." "I am glad you think so," Cole said, relief evident in his voice, "because I was worried you might find it too rough or too isolated." "This is home," Jane said firmly, "our home. And we are going to build a wonderful life here together." They spent the next several months settling into married life and working together to improve the ranch. Cole's 2 ranch hands, brothers named Pete and Sam Carson, returned for the spring season and were delighted to discover that their boss had brought home a bride. They treated Jane with respectful courtesy and helped Cole with the heavy work of branding the new calves and repairing fences damaged by the harsh winter. True to his word, Cole helped Jane establish contact with the families scattered throughout the surrounding area. By early summer, Jane had opened a small school in the corner of the barn that Cole cleaned out and converted for that purpose. 7 children ranging in age from 6 to 14 attended regularly, and their parents were thrilled to have a proper teacher for them. Jane proved to be a natural educator, patient and creative in her teaching methods. She made learning fun for her students, incorporating nature walks and practical lessons along with traditional reading, writing, and arithmetic. The children adored her, and their parents frequently told Cole how fortunate he was to have married such a remarkable woman. "I know," Cole always replied with a smile. "Believe me, I know." As summer turned to fall, Jane discovered she was expecting a child. She told Cole the news one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Cole's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "We are going to be parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Jane, you have made me the happiest man alive." "I am a little scared," Jane admitted, "but mostly I am just excited. I cannot wait to meet our baby." Cole placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child is going to be so loved," he said softly, "and so lucky to have you as a mother." Jane had to temporarily close the school as winter approached and her pregnancy advanced, but she promised her students she would reopen in the spring after the baby was born. The families were understanding, and many of the mothers visited Jane regularly, offering advice and support as her due date approached. Julia wrote faithfully from Marysvale, sharing news of her thriving seamstress business and her own blossoming romance with a young miner named Robert Cross. Jane was thrilled for her sister and wrote back lengthy letters describing her own happiness and her excitement about the coming baby. In February of 1877, exactly 1 year after Cole had found Jane praying in the snow, Jane gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, but Jane was strong, and with the help of Mrs. Henderson, who served as the local midwife, everything went smoothly. Cole paced anxiously outside the cabin for hours, until finally Mrs. Henderson emerged with a broad smile and told him he could come in and meet his son. Cole entered the cabin with his heart pounding and found Jane propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Cole approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. His son had a shock of dark hair and was making small, mewling sounds as he waved one miniature fist in the air. Cole felt something break open in his chest, a flood of love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "He is perfect," Cole whispered, reaching out to gently touch the baby's soft cheek. "Jane, he is absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Jane asked. Cole thought for a moment, then said, "I would like to name him James, after my father, James Cole Evans." "James," Jane repeated, testing the name. "Yes, I love it. Hello, James. Welcome to the world, little one." Over the next months, Cole and Jane settled into the rhythms of parenthood. James proved to be a good baby, healthy and alert, with his mother's green eyes and his father's strong features. Cole was a devoted father, often carrying James around the ranch in a sling Jane made, talking to him about cattle and horses and the land they would one day inherit. Jane reopened her school when James was 3 months old, bringing him with her and setting up a small cradle in the corner of the classroom. The children were fascinated by the baby and loved being allowed to peek at him when they finished their lessons. Jane juggled teaching and motherhood with grace, and Cole supported her fully, often taking care of James in the evenings so Jane could prepare lessons and grade papers. In late summer, Julia wrote with the news that she and Robert were engaged to be married. Jane was overjoyed for her sister and immediately began planning a trip to Marysvale for the wedding. Cole arranged for Pete and Sam to manage the ranch in their absence, and in early September, the Evans family made the long journey back to Colorado. The reunion between the sisters was emotional and joyful. Julia was thrilled to meet her nephew, cooing over him and declaring him the most beautiful baby she had ever seen. She had indeed made a successful life for herself in Marysvale, with a thriving seamstress business and a lovely small house that Robert had helped her buy. Robert Cross proved to be a good man, hardworking and clearly devoted to Julia. He was 25 years old, with sandy hair and kind blue eyes, and he worked as a foreman at one of the local mines. Cole liked him immediately and gave his blessing to the match when Robert nervously asked for it. explaining that, as Julia's brother-in-law, he felt it was his duty to look out for her interests. Julia and Robert's wedding was held in the same church where Cole and Jane had married, and it was a beautiful ceremony. Julia looked stunning in a dress she had made herself, and Robert could not take his eyes off her. Jane served as Julia's maid of honor, with Cole standing up for Robert at the groom's request. "I still cannot believe this is all real," Julia said to Jane at the reception, watching as Cole and Robert talked and laughed together like old friends. "A year and a half ago, we thought we were going to die in that cabin, and now look at us. You have a wonderful husband and a beautiful son. I am married to the man I love, and we are both living the lives we always dreamed of." "It is real," Jane assured her, squeezing her sister's hand. "It is all real, and we are so blessed." The Evans family stayed in Marysville for 2 weeks, enjoying time with Julia and Robert and renewing acquaintances with the townspeople who had been so kind to them. Little James was doted on by everyone, especially Mrs. Murphy, who declared him the finest baby she had seen in 40 years of running the boarding house. When it was time to return to Montana Territory, the goodbyes were bittersweet but not as painful as they had been the year before. Both sisters had their own lives and families now, and while they would miss each other, they were secure in the knowledge that they were both happy and loved. The journey home was peaceful and pleasant, with James proving to be an excellent traveler. Cole and Jane talked about their future, making plans for expanding the ranch and possibly building a larger house once they could afford it. They discussed having more children, both agreeing that they wanted James to have siblings. "I want a big family," Jane said. "I loved growing up with Julia, even though there were only 2 of us. I want our children to have that sense of belonging, of always having someone in their corner." "I want that too," Cole agreed. "As many children as God blesses us with, we will welcome them with open arms." Over the next several years, their dreams became reality. Jane gave birth to a daughter, Martha, in 1878, followed by another son, William, in 1880. The ranch prospered, growing from 100 head of cattle to over 300. Cole was able to hire on permanent help, including a young couple who served as ranch hands and housekeeper. This allowed Jane to focus more on her teaching, which had become increasingly important as more families settled in the area. In 1881, Cole began construction on a proper house, a sturdy 2-story building with enough room for their growing family and guests. He built it himself with help from Pete, Sam, and several of the local men, working through the summer and fall. The house was completed just before Christmas, and moving in felt like the fulfillment of every dream Cole and Jane had shared. The new house had a large kitchen with a proper stove, a parlor with a stone fireplace, 4 bedrooms upstairs, and a study where Jane could prepare her lessons. There was even a separate building that Cole built to serve as a proper schoolhouse, saving Jane from having to use the barn anymore. Julia and Robert came to visit for Christmas that year, and it was a joyous celebration. Julia was expecting their first child, and the sisters spent hours talking about motherhood and their hopes for their children. Robert and Cole worked together to build furniture for the baby's nursery, cementing the friendship that had grown between them. "You know," Julia said to Jane one evening as they sat by the fire, watching their husbands play with James, Martha, and William, "I still think about that day when you went out into the snow to pray. At the time, I was so feverish and confused that I was not entirely sure what was happening. But I remember hearing you go out, and I remember praying too, begging God not to take you from me. I remember kneeling there in the snow," Jane said softly. "I was so cold that I could barely feel my body anymore, and I knew that if I stayed out there much longer, I would freeze to death." But I also knew that I could not let you die without doing everything in my power to save you. So I prayed with everything I had, begging God to send help. And he sent Cole, Julia said with a smile. He sent Cole, Jane agreed, her eyes finding her husband across the room. As if sensing her gaze, Cole looked up and smiled at her, that same warm, loving smile that still made her heart skip a beat after 5 years of marriage. The man who answered my prayer and gave me everything I ever wanted. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Cole had not been riding through those mountains that day? Julia asked. Jane shuddered. I try not to think about it, but I cannot help but believe that we were meant to find each other. Maybe Cole was riding through those mountains specifically because God knew we needed him. Maybe his whole life had been leading him to that exact moment, just as mine had been leading me there. That is a beautiful way to think about it, Julia said, and I believe you are right. Some things are just meant to be. As the years continued to pass, the Evans family flourished. Jane's school grew to include over 20 students, and she hired an assistant teacher to help manage the growing number of pupils. Cole's ranch became one of the most successful in the territory, known for the quality of its cattle and the integrity of its owner. James, Martha, and William grew into healthy, happy children, later joined by 2 more siblings. A daughter named Sarah, born in 1883, and another son named Thomas, born in 1885. The house was always full of life and laughter, with children playing, students visiting, and neighbors stopping by for advice or companionship. Cole and Jane had become pillars of their community, respected and loved by everyone who knew them. Their marriage remained strong and passionate, a true partnership built on love, respect, and shared faith. Julia and Robert had 3 children of their own and remained close to Jane and Cole, visiting at least twice a year and hosting return visits. The cousins adored each other, and watching the next generation play together brought joy to both sisters. One evening in the summer of 1886, exactly 10 years after Cole had found Jane praying in the snow, the couple sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children were inside, supposedly getting ready for bed but more likely engaged in some elaborate game that would delay sleep for at least another hour. You remember this night 10 years ago? Cole asked, taking Jane's hand in his. How could I forget? Jane replied. It was the night you proposed to me in Marysvale. We were standing outside the church, and you had just bought me this ring. She held up her hand, the silver band with its small emerald still shining on her finger. Best decision I ever made, Cole said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. Jane, these past 10 years have been the happiest of my life. You have given me everything I ever wanted, a home, a family, love, purpose. I wake up every morning grateful that I was the one riding through those mountains that day. I am grateful too, Jane said, leaning her head on his shoulder. When I knelt in that snow and prayed for help, I never imagined that God would send me not just a rescuer but a soulmate. You are my answered prayer, Cole Evans. And you are mine, Cole replied, wrapping his arm around her and pulling her close. Even though I did not know I was praying for you until I found you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky turned from orange to pink to deep purple. Inside the house, they could hear the children finally settling down, their voices growing quieter as sleep began to claim them. You think they understand how lucky they are? Jane asked softly. Our children, I mean. Do you think they understand what a gift it is to grow up in a home filled with love? Maybe not yet, Cole said. But someday they will. Someday they will have families of their own, and they will look back on their childhood and realize what we gave them. I hope so, Jane said. I hope we are giving them everything they need to build good lives of their own." "We are," Cole assured her. "Look at how kind they are, how hardworking, how curious about the world. Those are not accidents, Jane. Those are direct results of the love and attention you pour into them every single day." Jane smiled and kissed his cheek. "We pour into them," she corrected. "You are just as involved in their lives as I am. You are a wonderful father, Cole." "I had a good teacher," Cole replied. "Watching you with our children has taught me what it means to truly love someone unconditionally." As full darkness fell, Cole and Jane finally went inside, checking on each of their children before retiring to their own room. James, now 9 years old, was fast asleep with a book still clutched in his hands. Martha, 8, had arranged all of her dolls carefully on the shelf beside her bed. William, 6, was sprawled across his mattress in the boneless way of young children. Sarah, 3, was curled up like a kitten, her thumb in her mouth. And baby Thomas, just over a year old, was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "5 beautiful children," Jane whispered as they stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching Thomas sleep. "5 miracles." "6 if you count me," Cole teased, making Jane laugh softly. "Especially if I count you," Jane agreed, taking his hand and leading him to their bedroom. The years continued to unfold with their share of joys and challenges. There were harsh winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, childhood illnesses and accidents. But through it all, Cole and Jane faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. Julia and Robert eventually moved to Montana Territory when Robert was offered a management position at a mine near Cole's ranch. Having Julia nearby was a dream come true for Jane, and the sisters were able to see each other regularly for the first time in years. Their children grew up together, as close as siblings. As Cole and Jane grew older, they watched with pride as their children became adults and started families of their own. James took over management of the ranch, showing the same integrity and work ethic his father had modeled. Martha became a teacher like her mother, opening a school in a nearby town. William studied law and became a judge. Sarah married a doctor and moved to Denver. Thomas followed in his Uncle Robert's footsteps and became a mining engineer. Through all the changes and passages of time, Cole and Jane remained devoted to each other. Even after 50 years of marriage, they still held hands on evening walks, still kissed each other good morning and good night, still looked at each other with the same love that had sparked to life on a cold winter day in 1876. On a spring morning in 1926, Jane sat in the parlor of the house Cole had built for her 45 years earlier, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Cole sat beside her in his favorite chair, his hair white now, his face lined with age, but his blue eyes still bright and clear. They were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and the house was filled with family who had come from near and far to honor the couple. James stood to make a toast, raising his glass high. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Two people who have shown us all what true love looks like. Dad, you have always said that Mom was your answered prayer, but I think you were both answering each other's prayers. You have built a life together that has blessed not just yourselves but everyone who has had the privilege of knowing you. Thank you for the example you have set, for the love you have shown, and for the family you have created. Happy anniversary. Happy anniversary." The room chorused, raising their glasses. Cole and Jane looked at each other, and in that moment they were 26 and 22 again, young and in love, standing in a small wooden church in Marysville, Colorado, promising to love each other for the rest of their lives. They had kept that promise through 50 years of joys and sorrows, triumphs and trials. "I love you," Cole said softly, just for her ears. "I love you too," Jane replied. "Today, tomorrow, and forever." As the celebration continued around them, Cole took Jane's hand and held it tightly, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand where that silver ring with the emerald still rested. He thought back to that cold February day in 1876, when he had been nothing more than a lonely cowboy riding through a blizzard, with no idea that his life was about to change forever. He had found a woman praying in the snow, desperate and half-frozen, begging God for a miracle. And in saving her, he had saved himself from a lifetime of loneliness. He had answered her prayer, but she had answered his too, the prayer he had not even known he was making. They had built a beautiful life together, filled with love and family and purpose. They had weathered storms both literal and figurative, always holding tight to each other. And now, in the twilight of their lives, they could look back with satisfaction and joy at everything they had created together. The house full of family, the laughter of children and grandchildren, the legacy of love they would leave behind, all of it had started with a prayer in a snowstorm, and a lonely cowboy who heard the call and answered. Cole Evans passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83 in 1933, surrounded by his family. Jane held his hand as he drew his last breath, whispering words of love that only he could hear. She followed him just 6 months later, unable to bear being separated from the man who had been her companion, her partner, and her greatest love for 57 years. They were buried side by side on a hill, overlooking the ranch they had built together, under the shade of an old cottonwood tree. They are a reminder that prayers are heard, that love is real, and that sometimes, when you need it most, help comes riding through the storm on a faithful horse, carrying hope and a future you never dared to dream possible. The ranch continues to this day, passed down through generations of Evans' descendants, each one raised on the story of how their family began with an act of faith and an answered prayer. The schoolhouse Jane built still stands, preserved as a monument to her dedication to education and her impact on the community. And every year on the anniversary of the day Cole found Jane in the snow, the family gathers at the graves on the hill to remember the love story that started it all. Because in the end, that is what it was, a love story. Not just the love between a man and a woman, though that was certainly at its heart, but also the love of family, the love of community, the love of faith, and the love of God who heard a desperate prayer on a cold winter day and sent exactly the right person at exactly the right time to answer it. And that love, real and true and lasting, continues to echo through the generations, a legacy that will never die.